Tonight, we're going to be beginning a new study, like I mentioned before in our devotional, on the life of Moses, or the story of Moses. This is called the life of Moses because we're going to be looking at Moses not just through one book. We're going to be looking at him through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, we won't do a verse-by-verse study like we did in the life of David with like 1 Samuel, but we're going to be looking at Moses' life, and so we won't get kind of bogged down with the Levitical code and Leviticus, but it's going to be very interesting. I think Moses is one of those characters that we have known about since we were a child. Many of us know a lot about Moses, but when you look at his life in detail, it's really easy to see nuggets that maybe you had read before, knew were there, but they kind of open your eyes maybe with a different time in life. And so I think Moses really is just an incredible biblical figure for us to study. I think it'll be really cool for us. Moses is the most beloved person in the Jewish faith, and so some people are surprised to find that out. Sometimes people say like David, or actually the top two is Ezra and Moses. Moses, who gives the law, and then Ezra, who's kind of influential with the Second Temple period and kind of reconstituting the law with God's people, at least in the mindset of most Jewish believers and scholars and rabbis, I guess you would say. But the life of Moses is incredibly interesting, and I'm really, really looking forward to our study. Tonight's going to be kind of an introduction to the life of Moses. I think it's important for us, like in most of our studies, to lay some groundwork first before we start looking at biblical text to kind of help us think about the things that were going on during the lifespan of Moses and how that kind of shaped what we're told about it in the Bible. And so the first thing I want us to look at is Moses, the man himself. Now, the Egyptian name for Moses is kind of hard, and because of hieroglyphics and what we know about the ancient Egyptian language is still kind of hard for us to know, especially in the terms of how it was said. But Moses is typically considered to be the Egyptian word for either drawn out or water, or perhaps even drawn out of water. And the interesting thing is that the most key and central figure of the Jewish faith actually has an Egyptian name. Now, why does he have an Egyptian name? That's right. Yeah, Pharaoh's daughter, right? You know, she draws him out of the water and calls him Moses, right? And so you see that connection there. But it is kind of interesting that Moses, being that, pinnacle Jewish individual, has an Egyptian name. So kind of interesting. He's a multifaceted character in the Bible. He's a prophet. He also says there's going to be another prophet that's going to come after him. And of course, the Bible tells us that was who? Jesus Christ, that's right. He was also a national leader. He was a leader of God's nation. That was Israel, of course. And he was also a friend of God. God talks about how he talks to the priests and the prophets through visions and through dreams, but he speaks face to face with Moses. And so Moses has a relationship with God that is unique, even in the Old Testament, as individuals who were able to communicate directly with God. Moses is even in a circle inside of that. And so very, very interesting. He was born to Jochebed and Aram. Jochebed, her name means glory of Yahweh. And her name is interesting because this is the first time in the Bible that someone has their name with Yah. And so, as you know, there are many names for God in the Old Testament. El, and then you have all the El combinations, whether it's Elohim or El Shaddai, or there's a long list of those. And then, of course, Yahweh is the name that is most known by individuals. It's the one that actually he gives in Exodus whenever he tells, when Moses asks, who am I supposed to go and say that sent me? And your Bible says that I am sent you. Well, that's the Yahweh, his personal name, that many people talk about, the personal name of God. You also see that in the opening pages of Genesis also, but Jochebed is the first person in the Bible who has a name with that Yah in it, Jochebed. And so one of the interesting things when talking about the Hebrew alphabet, there is no J in Hebrew, which is interesting for us because when you look at the Old Testament, there are J's everywhere, right? I mean, think about it. You've got Joshua, and you've got Jehu, and you got Jehoshaphat, and you got Jedediah, and you got Jochebed, and you got everything. If you've got American Standard, you got Jehovah, or in the Old Testament. There's J's everywhere. There's a problem. There's no J sound in Hebrew, just like there's not one in. Anybody know of a current? Hebrew is technically a current language. Anybody know of another current language that doesn't have a J sound in it? Spanish. There's another one too. What's that? I'm thinking German, right? Because Brittany's German family, and they speak German, so that's what I'm more familiar with. I'm not familiar enough with Arabic to say yes or no on that. Maybe not. Arabic is it's a Semitic language, just like Hebrew. So that if that's the case, that's probably true. But there is no. That's like Joseph in German is like Yosef, right? I mean, it's just like it is in Hebrew. And so that's one of the more interesting things. Used to Jehovah's Witnesses would tell you that unless you use the name Jehovah in your prayers, he wouldn't listen to you. God wouldn't listen to you because you weren't using his actual personal name. And then it's like, yeah, you can't even say Jehovah in Hebrew. Like, you can't even say the J word. So like, what? It's like, yeah, you can't do that. Like, oh, really? So, yeah, they don't say it anymore, obviously. But that used to be a big thing with the Jehovah's Witness, that you had to actually say Jehovah. It's like, well, actually, you can't even say J in Hebrew. Like, so there's a problem there.
All the J's have the same sound in, like, Spanish, Jesus, hey, is the sound of the J. The other language the same way as it.
Pretty much. A lot of times it's like a kind of, we would do like maybe a Y, like a ya, like where in Spanish it's more of an H, like a ha. There's more like a ya, like Yachabed.
Is that one the other one they was calling Jerusalem?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Jerusalem. Yeah. Or like Jesus is like even in in Greek it's like Jesus, like And so, yeah, there's not even like really a J in Greek either. And so just kind of interesting, tidbit there. But Jochebed marries Aram, who is from the tribe of Levi. Obviously, Moses is a Levite. Aaron, his brother, is a Levite. And that's why you're going to see that the priests come from the tribe of Levi. And also the high priest is a direct descendant of Aaron, which means he has to be a Levi, right? Because Aaron himself was from the tribe of Levi. So the Levites play a very important role in the life of the early Israelite nation, and it's going to continue on because that's going to be the tribe where the priests come from. He is saved from infanticide in Hebrews 11:23 through 25. In that text, it talks about the faith of Moses' parents. It says in that passage in Hebrews 11:23 through 25, it says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." Then 24 to 25, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Now, I've always known that Moses was 3 months old whenever he was put in the woven basket and put it into the river. But that story took on more meaning to me once I had a 3-month-old son myself. But seriously though, I mean, it's like, you're like, oh, wow, that was pretty bold of his parents. But when you have a 3-month-old child and you think about putting them in a woven basket and putting them in a river and then pushing it, hoping that God's going to take control. Now, you tell me how much faith that has as you hold your 3-month-old child. That's a lot of faith, man. There's a reason why it's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, because that's incredible. Man, Emmett's 8 months old, right? And I couldn't imagine 3 months old, putting him in a woven basket and putting him on a river. I mean, that's incredible. But his parents...
Still better odds than the sword, though, yeah.
That's true, yeah, it's better odds than an Egyptian sword, like you were saying. And so, unfortunately, we like to think how brutal that is, but as we live in our culture, infanticide and abortion is celebrated by politicians, celebrities, and media. We haven't really changed much in the last 3,000 years, sadly. Not to get on a soapbox, but to get on kind of a soapbox. And so we don't do it with Egyptian swords. We just do it with surgical tech, right, in a pristine hospital room. But anyways, and so he's put into the river, and it floats, and it goes to Pharaoh's daughter. And there, we've all seen the Charleston Heston 10 Commandments. She picks him up. She says he's going to call him Moses, and he's raised in Pharaoh's house. One of the interesting things about when this takes place, and one of the possibilities, has anybody heard of Hatshepsut? Anybody heard of her?
It's a female pharaoh, right?
That's right. She's known as the female Pharaoh because her husband dies and she takes over as Pharaoh. She depicts herself in a lot of masculine clothing. She rules for 26 years, I believe, until her son, Tutmos III, kind of comes to power. But she's the most famous female figure of ancient Egypt. And the way the time plays out, there's a chance, can't say for certain, that she actually may have been the one that drew Moses out of the river. If so, that would be really cool because she's pretty much the only major female character from Pharaoh's house in that time in history. Like I said, that's just pure speculation. Looking at the time frame, we don't know that for certain. But Jochebed makes a basket for Moses, puts him in, places it in the Nile River, makes his older sister Miriam, who's going to play an important part later in Moses' life, is supposed to watch him. When Pharaoh's daughter sees him, he's a Hebrew. Miriam says she knows someone that can be a nurse for Moses, and obviously talking about her own mother. So Jochebed gets to actually nurse her own son, and so we don't know how long that lasted, what type of the information was passed to Moses about him being a Hebrew. But he does grow up and at some point in his life decides that he's going to suffer affliction with God's people rather than the riches of Egypt. Now, I think one of the things that's oftentimes overlooked is the riches of Egypt portion. Pharaoh's family was the most wealthy and powerful family on the face of the earth at this time in history. I mean, we're talking, who's the most wealthiest man now? Is it Jeff Bezos or somebody else? I don't know. I can't keep up anymore.
I think Bill Gates has still got it.
Has he still got it?
I think he's still got it, barely hanging on.
Okay. I got some head shakers back there.
Another one.
Elon Musk, Bezos is worth 150 billion.
Was that pre or post divorce? And how do we work that? I don't know.
That's a good point.
Anyways, okay, wait a minute. Pick the top four. It don't matter, okay? How would you like to be raised in that house? I mean, get some cool stuff, right? I mean, you don't have a ball with a string. Was that?
The all from Amazon.
All from Amazon? The 2-day shipping, right? But I think about the wealth that he had, and then to leave that behind to suffer as, with a slave with the Egyptians, with the Hebrews, and then to go out and to be a shepherd in the desert. I mean, to be a shepherd is not a glamorous life at all today or 3,000 years ago. And so to think about the fortitude that Moses had to be able to look at all the wealth and riches, the most comfortable life by any standard in the ancient world, and for him to just simply give that up is really, really, really impressive, and a reason why Moses is such a beloved character. Any comments about Moses? Anything that you think about the personhood of Moses that's really cool? We'll talk about some of these things as we go on through the next, the 4 books of the Pentateuch after Genesis. But anything that just stands out to you about Moses?
I find it interesting that we are called out of the world via baptism through water, and Moses was drawn out of water. Since Noah was carried out by water.
Yeah.
So,
that sounds biblical.
even that in the beginning, water was very important in his life.
Yeah. I got a sermon called Where God Put Water. So that's a good one I can bust out. But you're right. You think about Moses, and like I said about Hebrews 11:26, and I use that for our devotional night, because I do think there is such a powerful parallel, right? I mean, Moses had to look at all the world had to offer him and say, Christ is better. And he had to do that 1,500 years before Christ was ever born. Right? And the Bible tells us in the book of Hebrews that we actually have a better understanding of God's love on this side of the cross than they did before the cross. And so if Moses thought Christ was so important and so majestic that he was willing to give up the treasures of the world for a conception, right, that we're told that they could see but not as plain as we can see, how much more should we give up the pleasures of this world because we know in fullness about who Christ was and what he brought for us and the love that God has to us through His Son. And so just, when you really stop and think about it, it really is a motivating idea. At least it is to me. I think it's very profound. Good comment. Anyone else about Moses?
he tried to get out of what God wanted him to do. He said he wasn't a good speaker and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, yeah. Everybody's got excuses, right? Except for me. I think we've all tried to use excuses with God, right? And so, yeah.
Did he have a stutter or a stammer or something? I heard that once. I can't remember who told me that.
Yeah, people think that he may have just because he says, I'm not a good speaker. But I hear that all the time when I ask people to, fill in for class or sermons and they don't stutter. So, I mean, so I don't know, maybe Moses was just trying to get out of it like, some people do today. So, but some people will say that, but there's no indication that was the case, right?
I heard a guy that stuttered so bad that he refused to be among people. And I asked him about the church. He said, I didn't want to go. People look at me and I can't talk.
Yeah, I'm sure. Obviously, I don't stutter. Obviously, sometimes I stutter and I don't have a stutter, or use the wrong words. Is Candy or Brandy here tonight? Brandy's at the hospital with Gary. I called Brandy Candy 15 times today, and knew it was Brandy the entire time. So I have no room to talk whether he had a stutter or not. But sometimes we just trip over our words, right? It's like Mel Tillis, right? It's like he'd have a conversation with somebody on TV and stutter the entire time and then start singing and never miss a beat, right? And so I always thought that was really cool. So anyways. Yes.
Moses growing up in the household of Pharaoh, he sure didn't get much teaching about God.
Yeah, that's what's interesting, about the exposure that he had. And obviously, being raised in Pharaoh's house, he probably would have had the best education that anybody could have had in the ancient world. And so, but you're right. What was the exposure like? Did he talk to slaves?
His mother was a keep in that probably.
Well, I think so too. Yeah, I think so too. I wish we knew more about that dissemination of information to Moses. Caleb?
A lot of times in the Old Testament, I find it interesting that God chooses, when he goes to Moses is right after he kills an Egyptian for mistreating a man of his own kind. We saw somebody that was getting mistreated and murdered them. We'd be a pretty bad person these days.
Yeah.
God sees that and decides that's somebody that he wants to build on. I find things like this when I look at them.
Yeah. Caleb brings out a great point, and I want to expound on what Caleb said, and I want to use another biblical character. Think about Paul, right? When you think about the life of Paul, Paul was the perfect person to be the chosen instrument of the Gentiles. You got a guy who was from Cilicia, a Gentile area. This is a man who knew Greek philosophy and poetry because he quotes it in his speeches, in his books. He was also, though, raised in Jerusalem from when he was a child, from the tribe of Benjamin, was a Hebrew of Hebrew and a Pharisees. And so he can quote poetry like a Gentile. He can quote scripture like a Hebrew, like a Pharisee, actually. And he knows how to travel throughout the ancient world. And he has Roman citizenship. It's amazing. Then you take, like Caleb was talking about, Moses. Moses, who's born a Hebrew, who's raised in Pharaoh's house, who kills an Egyptian and then lives as a Midian, basically kind of like a Canaanite or an Arab, right, shepherd for 40 years. And so when God goes to him and sends him back, find me a better person than somebody who knows Hebrew culture and language because he's a Hebrew, somebody who knows Egyptian culture and language because he was raised in Pharaoh's house. Oh, and by the way, he was a shepherd for 40 years, so he knows how to get about the wilderness. And already has marriage ties to one of the larger groups in that area. Find me a better person than these God's people. And it's just but if you go back and you look, he probably wouldn't have thought having to be given up by his real parents was a blessing, right? Or having to flee because he killed an Egyptian was a blessing, or being a shepherd for 40 years in the middle of the wilderness was a blessing, right? But God used all those things to accomplish something great through him. So all the struggles that we have in our life and things that we think are negative, how could God use that as a positive? How is that molding us to who we are? James?
I was wondering why a perfect guy like Paul, why didn't he buy in, or why didn't he live many more years to accomplish many more things?
That's a question above my pay grade, James. I don't know. It's a good question. I just don't know why it is when we die. You know, if you look at somebody, I had a professor, if you'd heard of him, named Stan Mitchell, that passed away last year. You know, Stan was in his upper 50s. You know, he was a fantastic preacher. He was an elder at a congregation that he was doing some wonderful work at. His grandchildren were below the age of like 6. He had a few of those. He led mission campaigns to Africa. I mean, the guy did a lot more good than most people in the church, let alone the world. And he drops down on Freed Hardeman's campus dead of a heart attack. Why? I got no clue. You know, could he have done more good if he lived longer? I think so. I know so. But it's a good question I don't have the answer for, right? I don't think any of us do. And so it's just one of those things, right? So, good question, terrible answer, but I don't know. All right? Good. Well, the next part, I think there's 3 parts of this. The next part is the Exodus. And so the Exodus is actually derived from the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Pentateuch. It's the Greek Exodus, which means departure. The Hebrew actually is, and these are the names. And so Exodus really is the next part of the narrative of Genesis, because literally the first word of Exodus is "and," right? And so you see this bridging between the descendants of Israel going down into Egypt, being there. Of course, obviously, Joseph and his brothers and their descendants, and then the Exodus away from Egypt. And so Mosaic authorship is mentioned in Exodus itself in chapter 17, verse 14, chapter 24, verse 4, chapter 34, verses 4, and also verses 27 to 29. It's also mentioned elsewhere in the Pentateuch. It's also mentioned in the Old and New Testament, and also Jesus himself in numerous passages like John 5, 46 to 47 talks about Moses being the authorship of the Pentateuch. We talked about this in pretty lengthy detail in our introduction to Genesis, so I'm not going to recover that. But most scholars will tell you that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. Most scholars are wrong. I'm just going to leave it at that. And so, if Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, then that's news to Jesus. And so, I'm going to stick and say that Jesus probably knew better than a German scholar in the 1800s. Anyways, and so the entire book focuses on 2 years. And so when you think about the length of Exodus, the book only focuses on 2 years. The year before the Exodus and the year kind of the Exodus. And so you have a lot of information packed around these 2 years. And so one of the interesting things is when did the Exodus take place? There's 400 years where the children of Israel are in Genesis. We do know that Israel grows from kind of a mid-sized clan, about 70 men, we're told, to, in Numbers chapter 1, verse 46, we're told there's 603,000 fighting men over the age of 20, which would put the number of the Israelite nation in the millions. And so they grow quickly while they're in Egypt. And so the year that you see there is around 1446. This comes from 1 Kings 6:1 and Judges 11:26. 1 Kings 6:1 says, "In the 480th year of the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, the month of Ziv, which is in the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord." This places the Exodus 480 years before Solomon's 4th year. Scholars can pinpoint this to be right at 967 BC, and so once you do the math, it puts it about 1447, 1446. This also corresponds to Judges 11:26, whenever Jephthah says it's been 300 years since they came into the wilderness or to the land of Canaan. We don't know exactly when Jephthah lived, but we do know that places it in the 15th century, which would correspond to what we know about 1446. And so right around that time frame. There are those that argue for a later date in the 1250s. They would cite archaeological evidence for that, but the hard stuff of that is those things that they claim from the 13th century that they would say correspond to the conquest land of Canaan could just as easily be referring to the children of Israel and their struggles during the Judges period. And so there's a push to date the Exodus later than what the Bible tells us, but there's really no reason to do that. The Egyptian kings are hard to nail down sometimes, but this would most likely, Tutmosis III or Amenhotep will be the two pharaohs that are potentially the pharaoh that whenever Moses leads the children out of the land of Israel. And so that does kind of help us a little bit in understanding what may or may not have been the politics, the reign, the things that were going on in Egypt at the time of the Exodus that can help us understand a little bit about what is going on. The structure of Exodus can be seen in multiple ways. One of the two ways that I think is helpful is location. Egypt, wilderness, Sinai. And that first section is how you can break down the book of Exodus in those three sections. The second way is contents. God freeing them out of bondage, God giving them the law, and then God giving them the tabernacle. And so either way you want to do that, there are other ways you can find online or from different books that you read, but those are just two ways that I think are kind of helpful for us to kind of structure the book of Exodus, location, and also content. Any questions or comments on the book of Exodus itself? Or the exodus of the Israelites? Well, like I said, we'll go into this in much more detail later on as we go through the class, but if you've got something that you'd like to say, or maybe you've got a question that we're not going to cover tonight, but maybe help us understand some things we can prepare whenever those times do come. We'll look at some different theories about the route of the Exodus and other things like that. I think it'll be interesting. No? All right. The next thing, one of the things that's oftentimes overlooked is Egypt itself. And so, as you can see from our previous slide, a lot of what takes place in the book of Exodus, or at least early in Moses' life is oftentimes broken down into 3 40-year periods. The 40 years in Egypt, the 40 years as a shepherd, and the 40 years of wandering or leading God's people during the wandering years, which means that a third of Moses' life he spends in Egypt. And so a lot of what Moses is as a person is shaped by the fact that he was raised in Egypt, that he is raised in an aristocratic home, and that he understands Egyptian politics. He understands the Egyptian civilization. And so I think that those things really help mold the story of Exodus, that helps us understand better who Moses was as a person. The Hebrew name for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which is the name of the oldest, or not the oldest, but one of the sons of Ham. Now, who is Ham? Noah's sons, right? And so maybe this points to the Egyptians being descendants of Ham. I don't know. I'm just telling you the same name, and there's probably a correlation there. But that's in Genesis 10:6 and Genesis 10:13. That is not what the Egyptians call themselves. They call themselves the lands, referring to both Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, you may ask yourself, why do we call Egypt Egypt? Well, one of the most powerful cities and most important cities in ancient Egypt was Memphis, not the one on the Mississippi River, the one on the Nile River, right? They're two different ones. And so, yeah, the Elvis, is the king, not the pharaoh. So it corresponds in some ways it doesn't. But Memphis was a very powerful city, and the Greeks called that Egyptus, which obviously sounds like what? Egypt, okay? Egypt had 31 dynasties, going from 3000 BC to 323 BC. That is a long time. That is a very long time. When you think about the history of the U.S. pretty much being 200 and something years, and you think about a dynasty lasting for 2,700 years, that is insane. Anybody know what happens in 323 BC? All right, yeah. Any particular Greek in particular? A little guy named Alexander the Great, right? How cool would it be when you die for them to be like, you know what? Isaac the Great was really good. Like, he was a great guy. I don't know, it'd just be cool. Anyways, Alexander the Great conquers Egypt, and that puts pretty much an end to the Egyptian rule. The Greeks will control Egypt for 400 years until somebody else comes into town. Anybody know what that is? the Romans, right? And so the Romans pretty much absolved the Greek Empire. And so the Ptolemies are going to be centered in Egypt. And so the Greeks will rule there for 300 years, and then the Romans will come in and rule. And that's kind of what you see when we get to the New Testament, the times of Jesus. And so the culture was heavily influenced on the Nile River. It's one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the world. At the time that we're reading, this was the oldest and the most powerful civilization in the ancient world at the time of Moses. And the patriarchs would have seen the powerful pharaohs, the massively large pyramids that were hundreds of years old even at their time. One of the interesting things, and you guys can't see that, but it's a breakdown of the 31 dynasties of the Egyptians. This is a picture of ancient Egypt. What you're going to see here, 99% of the population of Egypt in the ancient times lived right on the Nile River. Anybody know why? What's the rest of that? There's desert, right? And so unless you live right beside the Nile River, the Nile floods every year. What that does is put nutrients and a fresh layer of silt on the land. And so close to the river, you could have that new silt, those nutrients, and also it was easier to irrigate. And so this was known as the breadbasket of the ancient world. When you look at there, that's not a huge swath of land. This fed the majority of the ancient world. There were grain shipments at the time of Jesus, even after Jesus' day. They had grain shipments that went from Egypt to Rome every single day. Multiple grain shipments. It was huge. Egypt literally fed the ancient world. And so it was extremely fertile, extremely wealthy. Even in the days of Rome, this was the wealthiest part of the ancient world. These are the great pyramids at Giza. I want you to think about how cool this is for a second. When Abraham goes into Egypt in the chapters of Genesis, true or false, were these pyramids there? Yes. And they had been there for 500 years. Think about that for a second, right? There haven't been Europeans on this continent for 1492. That was the Caribbean. Anybody know when it got to Florida? Anybody? Or Mexico? It's been about 500 years, okay, since, we've been on the actual continent of the Americas, right? Think about Abraham going to Egypt and these things being hundreds of years old. Maybe they've been there for 200 years instead of 500 years. They've been there a long time, right? Think about Joseph going down to Egypt and being sold into slavery and passing these things, right? We have skyscrapers today, and they're still impressive to us. What do you think about those guys? When Moses leads the children of Israel out of Egypt, these things have been there for almost 1,000 years. Think about that for a second. That is insane, right?
Wouldn't that change if we estimate from how long Earth has been here, would that make a big change?
Not for me, because I would still place this within the time frame of the biblical account of how old the earth is. That wouldn't put it before, what the Bible says was created with the Garden of Eden and stuff like that. It would just put it pretty close to the flood if it's going to be several hundred years before Abraham. Which is impressive, but you don't have to have, thousands of years of technology to, well, it's like if you watch conspiracy theories, right? They're like the alien, there were aliens, because if you look at the Egyptian pyramids, the Babylonian ziggurats, the Incan Mayan temples, they're all the same. It's like, well, how do you think you build tall stuff, right? You get a really large platform and you get smaller as you go up. How long does that take to figure out, right? And so I don't think it was the aliens, right, telling all these different people how to build, large structures. And so, and you just need a lot of manpower, right? And so going back to this, in the ancient world, the Pharaoh was seen as a divine figure, right? He was a manifestation of God, which is why it is so powerful, right, whenever God puts Pharaoh in his place, right? Now, he can tell his people all day long that he is a god, demigod, or even a full-fledged God. But God lets the Pharaoh know pretty quickly that he is actually the one in control. Todd?
Now, that wasn't always true about Pharaoh.
No.
Because when Abraham met Pharaoh, Pharaoh believed in the Lord because the Lord visited him and basically kept him from doing something wrong. So it's just like with Caesar.
Yeah.
There was a point in time where it just they transcended over that their God. And if you think about it, that's happened with the Babylonians, it happened with the it happened with any world power that the leaders there started thinking, well, I'm better than whoever.
Yeah, and even the pharaohs who in their minds embodied God, right? They still believed in higher beings like Amun, Ray, and all those guys like that too. And so, but like you were saying, it's interesting to see how that culture relied on one person, right? That like you were saying, you see it throughout all time, right? I mean, with whether it's Augustus or Caesar and the emperor cult, or other ancient worlds, or even people who worship celebrities today, or even political figures, right? And so, the celebrity cults. Anything else? No? All right, we're looking forward to our study of Moses, and let's go ahead and close in a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day and for all the many blessings you've given us. We're so thankful for the men of the Bible and the women of the Bible that we can look to as imperfect, but yet still examples of what faith looks like in action. We're thankful for their lives. We're thankful for the dedication they had to you and to your will. And dear Heavenly Father, we hope and pray that as Christians, that each and every one of us are living our lives in such a way that we can be people of faith, just like Moses and other individuals recorded in the Bible. Help us to also choose the approach of Christ over the riches of the world and what sin and Satan has to offer. And dear Heavenly Father, we pray that you please be with us as a congregation and help us to be a shining light to this community like the Israelites were supposed to be in the Old Testament. Help us to have the drive to follow you in the wilderness of life and to be sure that we are being faithful each and every day. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.